This is Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing. I'm Rachel Gordon. Here we aim to make the process of writing and publishing a bit more transparent and a bit less overwhelming. Through conversations with editors and academics at all stages, from full professors to graduate students, independent scholars, and postdocs, we share stories, lessons, and helpful habits from our writing lives. We're delighted today to get to speak with Professor Richard Breitman. Richard is the Distinguished Professor Emeritus at American University and the former editor of the journal Holocaust and Genocide Studies. He is the author or co-author of more than 12 books and many articles in German history, U.S. history, and the Holocaust. His books, The Architect of Genocide, Himmler and the Final Solution with Knopf, and Official Secrets, What the Nazis Planned, What the British and Americans Knew, were translated into 5 languages. And Richard, congratulations on your latest book, which is titled A Calculated Restraint, What Allied Leaders Said About the Holocaust, which was recently published, I think just very recently by Harvard.
Yes, this month.
Great. You've been writing about the Holocaust and World War II for decades. Did you always realize that there was this much to say about it? Or at the start of your career, did you think you might write a book or two on the subject and then move on to related historical subjects?
There's a story behind all this. My first book was an expansion of my dissertation, which was about the Social Democratic Party in Weimar Germany. And when I got that published, I figured I had pretty well exhausted whatever ideas I had on that subject. So I went around looking for a new topic. And 3 things led me into the direction of the Holocaust. First of all, I was assigned to teach a course at American University on Nazi Germany, and it was popular, and I got assigned each year to keep teaching it. Secondly, someone asked me to find some documents about America and the Holocaust that could be used as an exhibit at a conference. And thirdly, that led me to the National Archives, and I began to realize what a treasure of material was there. It wasn't just the receptacle for historically valuable American government records. There were 60,000 rolls of microfilm of captured German records. So within a relatively short time, I realized that I had a basically almost infinite supply of primary sources if I wanted to really take the time to learn how to use the material. And after that, it was kind of one book led to the next. I mean, I can give you specific examples, but as I was doing the research for my second and third books, I turned up material on Himmler, and that led later to a book on Himmler. And the book on Himmler turned up new controversy and some new thoughts I had. And eventually that resulted in my book, Official Secrets. I got very interested in an American diplomat named Raymond Geist, who was in Berlin for 10 years, but I never had enough material to write a book about him. I just collected material and hoped someday I could use it somehow. And then another scholar turned over his State Department personnel file to me, which for the first time illuminated his early life. And I really thought I had a much better sense of him as a person. And that led to many decades later, it led to my 2019 book, The Berlin Mission. So one thing led to another.
It's interesting. You're not the first person who told me that going to the National Archives showed them there was more to write on a topic or gave them the subject for their next book. I've never been to that archive yet. Is there something, I guess, is it just that they have so much, or why does that happen there?
It's that they have so much. And in my case, I didn't have to worry about basically the expense of doing research, because for me, it was 25-minute drive from my home. Well, actually, when I started, I was going downtown to the old National Archives. And from the early 1990s on, I think, I was going to Archives 2 at College Park. But either way, it wasn't a long drive, and I didn't have to pay motel rates to keep doing intensive research. And as a result, I felt I could do some things that other people couldn't afford to do.
Yeah. In many ways, this most recent book feels very timely, and not just because we're in the 80-year anniversary of the end of World War II, but also because, and just to remind folks of the title of this book, it's called A Calculated Restraint: What Allied Leaders Said About the Holocaust. And it seems like we're in an era again when public statements by leaders feel kind of more important than ever. It seems like we once thought of these public statements as kind of pro forma, but they've been very under scrutiny recently. Did this area of research come from contemporary concerns, or how did this focus come about for this book?
Again, there's a story. I was asked to write a relatively short article for a Cambridge history of the Holocaust, which it's about to come out or actually has come out in some places. And I wrote that years ago on the Allies and the Holocaust. And I realized that what I wanted to know above all was the role of Allied leaders, and there wasn't anything written on it. And so I asked myself, could I really come up with something new, given the fact that they didn't talk about the Holocaust much, and that I would have to fill in a lot of background about them. And also, when they could have spoken up but didn't, after some thought, I realized that I had solved a mystery about Churchill. I had written about Churchill back in 1998 with Official Secrets, and a lot of people identified Churchill as a kind of early voice of conscience during the Holocaust because he had given a speech on August 24th, 1941. I won't read you the quote, but he concluded it by saying, "We are in the presence of the crime without a name." And his official biographer, Martin Gilbert, basically said he was talking about the Holocaust. And first of all, there was a problem with that interpretation because he'd never mentioned anywhere in that speech Jews. And secondly, I wanted to look at the whole speech, not just that one section, small section, to see if I could figure out what his motive overall was in that speech. And I quickly came to the conclusion that he was trying to tighten relations with the Soviet Union and with the United States. This was a speech in which he reported on his very recent shipboard meeting with Franklin Roosevelt, but he also, having been a lifelong anti-communist, he wanted to keep the Soviet Union fighting Nazi Germany, and Stalin had already asked him to open a second front on the continent, and he knew that Britain couldn't do that. And so he wanted to keep Stalin on side. And he ended up praising Soviet resistance to the Nazis. And that was a major theme in the speech. And if you look at the wording of the section that Gilbert says was about the Holocaust, he talks about Russian patriots defending their native soil and being executed for it. He doesn't mention Jews. So I looked, and sure enough, Churchill had used a very similar phrase, Russian patriots putting up great resistance, in one of his letters to Stalin. And so I felt I had solved that mystery and I had something new to begin with. And then virtually nobody had written about Stalin because Stalin said so little about Jews and the Holocaust, but there was one key speech in which it fit. And I thought I could show that the speech had some consequences in terms of Soviet media coverage of the Holocaust. And then Roosevelt. Well, Roosevelt was the one that I knew the best from past work. And I knew the archives very well. And I knew that Roosevelt had given a statement at a press conference in March 1944, in which he specifically talked about the Holocaust and tried to help his War Refugee Board deal with and put up resistance against the Holocaust in Hungary. And I knew that I could come up with more information here and there and put that in context. Rebecca Elberding had done a book on the War Refugee Board in which she talked about that event, but she hadn't gone into great detail about Roosevelt, and I knew I could. So I felt I had enough new material to string together a narrative. And well, we'll see if the reviewers agree that I've got new material.
I'm curious if you think interest in this question of why the Allied leaders didn't talk about the Holocaust or Jews more has grown. I guess I imagine that 40 years ago, this might have seemed like too parochial a concern or question to focus on when and if they ever used the word Jew or some word that meant the Holocaust at the time before they used that term. I mean, why do you think historians or students of history might be more interested in this now?
Well, let me answer that in two different ways. First of all, the question of not speaking out was raised a long time ago with Pope Pius XII. And there was a huge controversy, which some of which continues until today. Although Kurzer's book on the papacy has resolved a lot of issues, but nobody had applied this. The American government was asking Pope Pius XII to speak out, and Roosevelt wasn't speaking out at that time. And so I felt that this could have been raised much earlier. The implication of your question is that we've become more attuned to moral issues over time, and we see omission of action as negligence. And a lot of people have delivered very harsh judgments about really all of the Allies, but Roosevelt seems to have taken a worse beating than Churchill, in part because of Churchill's early speech. And so, yes, I did want to speak to the question of how have standards changed in judging Allied leaders. And I mean, maybe we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes, but I tried to strike a balance in my conclusion because the war affected the Holocaust in many ways. And even if Allied leaders were reluctant or negligent at times in not speaking out about it, there could have been a worse Holocaust had it not been for the way the Allies pursued the war, held the alliance together, and in Roosevelt's case, pushed very hard for an invasion of North Africa in 1942, which helped to prevent a Holocaust in North Africa and Palestine. And so I wanted to try to balance the errors of omission with the rather capable strategic vision that Allied leaders had about the war.
Yeah, I moving to a different topic a little bit. I wanted to ask you, you've published over a dozen books, some of them co-authored. Was there anything like a master plan for which books you would write when, or did a particular book seem like this was a good post-tenure book or later in the career book?
No master plan. One book led to another, or one find while I was doing research. I mean, I didn't know who Raymond Geist was when I started researching America and the Holocaust. And as I said, for decades, I didn't have enough to do a book on him. But when I got a whole cluster of material about his early career, and then I managed to link up with one of his relatives who told me for the first time that he was gay, all of a sudden, and had a portion of a youthful diary, all of a sudden I had enough to write. So one thing led to another.
When you've had graduate students, have you found yourself advising them about thinking about when to write a particular book, or is that not the way you think about it?
I do think graduate students have to finish a dissertation and a book in a relatively compact period of time. And I think it's therefore a mistake for graduate students to take on very broad subjects where they really can't look at all of the sources and maybe don't even have time to master all of the historiography. So I try to urge a focus for the first book. But after that, if you get through that, you get a first book published, you have a lot more leeway.
Relatedly, since retiring, has your thinking about writing books or articles changed?
Not a great deal. Well, I publish fewer articles. I like to publish books. I'm not on the clock. I don't have to publish something every year for merit pay. And I really enjoy doing research and writing. I felt I was sort of at the age where I was struggling a little more to get through to students, generation gaps. And I felt if I gave up teaching, I could continue writing at a pretty good pace and still have enough energy to pursue books to conclusion. And so I've had a couple now, and I'll probably go another one or so.
Sounds good. You've published with several different presses, and some of our listeners, I know many academics wonder, why does an academic move around? You've published, for instance, with UNC, Indiana, Harvard, and trade presses, including Knopf and Simon and Schuster. What's motivated that moving from press to press?
Well, apart from my first and third books, I had an agent who would sound out different publishers and let me know where he thought the book would go best. There are certainly material advantages in going with commercial publishers, and there are advantages of, what shall I say, independent judgment that go with academic presses. The editors tend to interfere less with one's writing, and academic presses also keep books in print for a considerably longer time. If a commercial book doesn't do very well, it can go out of print. And so, I've done both. The best editor I ever had was with a commercial press, a woman named Elizabeth Sifton, who was famous in the field. And I've also had bad experiences. And, different people will come to different judgments about which way they want to go. But this last book, we tried commercial presses and none of them was interested. So I had done very well at Harvard with a previous book co-authored with Alan Lichtman, FDR and the Jews, the best-selling book in this country that of all the books I published. And so I said, well, let's go with Harvard. And Harvard was interested. So that's why it turned out the way it did.
Yeah, I mean, FDR and the Jews is a book I've used a lot and still use. I'm curious with the agent is that many of our guests has talked about their experience of finding an agent. This seems very mysterious to many academics. I mean, it's not something that's always openly discussed in grad school, when and why someone would go trade. How did the meeting the agent process work for you?
Well, there's another story there. One of my early research projects was to try to solve a mystery about the identity of the German industrialist who leaked what was thought to be the first overall report of the Nazi final solution to the West. And I won't go into all the details. It was really one of probably the most difficult research problem I had in my career. But I did actually find out who the man was, and I was able to link up with Walter LaCour, who was a famous historian without a PhD, who wrote many dozens of books. And he had gone to school with the industrialist's son. And we got together and wrote something between a biography and a study of what happened to this report, the Regner telegrams. And when I made the discovery, there was a lot of publicity because LaCour had tried to find out the man's identity and had written an article about it, but he hadn't been able to. So it was kind of big news. And the Washington Post reporter who wrote an article about the discovery recommended a friend of his, Joe Spieler, who was a book agent, and the reporter, Charles Fenyvesi, who's now passed away, said, this is going to become a book and you need a good agent for it. So that's how I got my agent, and I've stayed with him.
Huh. So that's been a long, good relationship, it sounds like.
Yeah, he's a friend now.
That's really great. Going back to what you mentioned before with FDR and the Jews being It sounds like the best selling of your books. That's really interesting. I mean, it sounds niche. So, how do you explain why this one was so popular?
A lot of it is that historians regard Roosevelt as, one of the top three presidents. And yet there's a group of people who literally hate Franklin Roosevelt, and specifically people in the Jewish community who regard him as responsible for negligence and or anti-Semitism during the Holocaust. And so these two sides are fighting periodically. And when I got together with Alan, we quickly concluded that both sides were exaggerating. It wasn't as though Roosevelt was a hero for the Jews, but it wasn't as though he was the great villain either. And one had to look at specific situations and changes over time in his policies, which changed over time. So we tried to strike a balance, and then we were lucky enough, once we finished, to get an article in the New York Times about the controversy. And so that very briefly put the book on the bestseller list, and it's just continued. That was 2013, and it still sells each year.
Wow. Yeah. Since you've had that experience of co-authoring, many academics in the humanities, we don't get to co-author, especially not a book. How was that? And was it more fun or less work or more work?
At times it was more work, but it was a lot more fun. You have to know your co-author very well. And even then, there will be rough patches when you disagree on things. But, we got over those. And I'm sure that it was a much better book because of my editing Alan's work and Alan's editing my work. And none of us ever being quite satisfied that we had, perfect prose, and we tried to make it as readable as possible for a broad audience. And Alan is very good at that. So I learned some things in the course of that collaboration, and I ended up doing more collaborations with somebody else, Norm Goda at University of Florida, and so it's worked out.
Yeah, I mean, even broaching the idea to another academic can seem like it makes one very vulnerable. I don't know how it started in your case. Did who thought of the idea and how was it discussed?
My agent was, I first proposed doing a book on Roosevelt and the Holocaust, and Joe Spieler said, "Hasn't that been done?" And I said, "Well, yes, but it hasn't been done well enough." And he said, "Well, but the publishers are going to think it's been done, and that's going to be difficult." And then he said, "Why don't you do a book on Roosevelt and the Jews, his whole lifetime?" And I said, "Oi." And then I thought for a while. I said, maybe I could do a co-authored book. Let me see if I can get Alan Lichtman involved in that. And you probably know his name. He's a very good historian of the presidency and American politics. And so he could go deeper into things that I knew, but not as well. And he could go into Roosevelt's youth and do a lot of the early stuff, and I could do the late 30s and wartime stuff, and we could put the pieces together. And as I said, we each edited the other's chapters, and it just clicked.
Yeah, it really did. Publicity is a topic that comes up on our podcast a lot. What academics can expect press to do to publicize our books, as well as what we ourselves are trying to do to get them out in the world. So I imagine that this has changed a lot over your career. And I wonder, based on your experience and perhaps that of your grad students or colleagues, what you've discovered works these days for academics to publicize their books and I guess maintain their dignity while doing it.
Well, these days it's quite different than
Yeah.
some of the experiences I've had considerably earlier. I still like to get journalists interested if I think I've discovered something, really new and newsworthy for a broad audience. For example, Churchill's speech of August 24th, 1941, that he wasn't really thinking of what we call the Holocaust when he gave that statement about this is a crime without a name. And I suspect some British journalists will eventually get around to writing about it. It hasn't happened yet because the book, I think the publication date in Britain is May 30th. But I think that's something people always ask me about Churchill, just like they ask about Roosevelt. And if a journalist becomes convinced that this is newsworthy and you get an article in a major newspaper or even in the Jewish press, it does sell books. And so that helps a lot. As a general rule, I think commercial presses are better with publicity than academic presses. But there are exceptions, and I'm hoping this time will be an exception.
I guess what you mentioned about getting journalists involved, I imagine agents might be helpful in this, but how does that happen that a journalist gets interested in a historian's book?
Agents or publicists. There are basically independent publicists who basically promote a story to journalists. And I've worked on a project with sponsorship. I worked with a publicist named Kathy Caligari, who was very good. And she knows journalists personally and can pitch particular stories to them. And sometimes the people who do this for a living are better than the press, an academic press's publicists. Not always, but sometimes.
Right. There's two questions that we ask all guests, and one of them is, what is something you wish you had known earlier in your career about writing or publishing?
Well, one thing that I didn't quite know coming out of graduate school is that you better know what you're adding to the existing storehouse of knowledge. You better have a clear sense of that because you're going to get asked about it. And if you can't answer, you're probably not going to get a book accepted. And you also need to have a sense of who your primary audience is. For example, in my first book, I wanted to reach specialists in German history and some in the world of the international socialist movement. And I wanted to get good academic reviews, and I wanted the book to be of good enough, to have a good enough reception so that I'd get tenure and be well regarded at my university. And that was my primary audience. And I tried to write it as well as I could, but I never expected that I would, sell more than a couple thousand books. Money wasn't really the issue. Later books, particularly Breaking the Silence, a book I wrote with Walter LaCour, that was for a big commercial press, and we really wanted to reach a broad audience. And I don't think it was a success for in Simon & Schuster's terms, but we certainly got it translated in multiple languages and got a lot of publicity for it. So we never made back our advance, but it sold reasonably well.
When you say the importance of knowing what you're contributing or changing the field, is this because you've been in those conversations with an editor and an agent where you've been asked that or some version of it and you felt like you weren't able to give quite the right answer, or how do you come by that?
Well, that's one example. When you write a book proposal, you have to identify that. And I always complain that I don't know things well enough at the beginning of a project to be able to identify exactly what I'm going to conclude. I mean, I start with a question. I don't start with a well worked out thesis. And I don't really get deep into the material until I've done this writing day after day, week after week. And then I begin to realize things that I never thought about before. So that's one issue, book proposals, writing book proposals. But I also remember some of the early reaction to what became my first book when I wrote my dissertation. People said, "What's new?" And I struggled with that answer there. And, I never wanted to be in that position again, which led me to do sometimes to over research to make sure that I had explored every possibility for finding new documents that would, on the surface, be obviously new.
Mm, yeah, since So many of your books are really so readable, and some are published by trade press. How did you learn, I wonder, to write in this not jargony academic way, but way that's really much more enjoyable for the reader?
It started early. I had a very good English teacher in high school who made us write in class and then put different samples up on the projector on the screen. And he would say, "Do we know what this sentence really means? Okay, if we know what it really means, can it be made shorter? Does everybody understand this word?"
Mhm.
And I mean, it was kind of excruciating at times, but it really sank in. And I tried as a teacher to help all of my students improve their writing, even graduate students. And some of them sometimes were not pleased to learn that what they had used to get through college was not regarded as sufficient.
Mm.
But I felt I was adding something. And occasionally somebody would say, "I get it." And it was
Mhm.
a kind of breakthrough moment. And then I'd recommend books on writing as a way of deepening my own comments. So I pay a lot of attention to it.
Yeah. Do you have any of those books in mind that you could mention to us?
Well, Strunk White is an old classic.
Another question we ask guests is if there's a writing practice or habit that works for you.
Once I start writing, I like to write almost every day. It doesn't have to be hours and hours, but I like to keep the material fresh in my mind. And if you're only capable of, writing for 3 hours a day, that's fine. But sometimes either that evening or the next morning, you want to go over what you've written and tear it apart and put it back together again in a better form, and then go on to the next paragraph or the next chapter and keep going with it. And it's better to write something that you don't like than not to write anything at all.
Mm. Yeah, agreed. Do you have periods that, I mean, I feel like people don't use the language of being blocked anymore, but do you have periods when it's not going well or
You do have periods where you hit, an obstacle, and either you don't know enough to be able to write it well, or you're just not coming up with something that you think is fresh. And it doesn't happen often with me, but it has happened. And I just would say, okay, I'll leave that aside. Let me start the next chapter, because you want to keep writing something.
Yeah.
I had a period in this book where there was a delay in the readings, the outside readings for Harvard, the peer review, and I was impatient and I wasn't ready to start a big new project before I knew that this one was accepted and done, but I didn't want to stop writing. So I started keeping call it a political diary of current events. Every morning I would summarize what made an impression on me. And just having the experience of formulating my thoughts and verbalizing them in a way that I think other people will understand was useful, because when I had to go back and make revisions, I was ready to start right away. Getting started when you're writing is always more difficult than continuing.
Agreed. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Richard. This has been really interesting to get to talk with you. I've enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you for the interview and for the good questions.
Thanks for listening to Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing, sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. Visit our podcast description to find out how to contact us and send us your questions about academic writing and publishing. Follow us on social media at Writing It Pod and subscribe to us so you never miss an episode.